The beacon was broadcasting to nobody. I almost missed it, the debris field at the edge of the Cassini expanse is exactly the kind of place where old things go to die quietly, and we had been picking through it for 6 days, looking for salvageable alloy plating. The Verity groaned every time I pushed. Her engines passed 30%. The ship was tired. We were tired. The job paid barely enough to cover fuel, and the 3 of us had been eating rehydrated protein bricks for a week. Then the receiver pinged. Not a distress signal, not a collision warning, something older than both. Diplomatic frequency, assembly band deep. Register, the kind of channel that hasn't been actively used in so long that our navigation system flagged it as a ghost reading and tried to clear it from the display. I overrode the system manually, sat up straight in my chair for the first time in days, and listened. It was a loop, 43 seconds long, playing again and again into the empty dark. This is Earth. We are ready to join you. We look forward to meeting you. I sat with that for a long time. Dove came forward from the engine bay, wiping his hands on a cloth that was somehow dirtier than his hands. He was 26, built like someone who had grown up in low gravity and then spent years correcting that mistake through manual labor. He had a good face, the kind that always looked like it was about to ask a reasonable question. He looked at my expression and stopped, wiping his hands. What is it? I pointed at the receiver display. And GT, snorts. And GT. He leaned in. Read the frequency band. Read the signal origin coordinates. His mouth opened slightly. He did not say anything for a moment. That's a diplomatic welcome buoy, he said finally. Yes. Earth. Yes. He straightened up. How long has it been out here? I ran the registration numbers against the Assembly's public record archive. The archive was slow. It had to pull from a database that had not been seriously updated in centuries. The results came back in chunks, each one a little worse than the last. The buoy had been launched from Earth's L2 orbital point. Launch date 994 years ago. Diplomatic registry filed with the Galactic Assembly the same week. Status in the Assembly record: active, pending response. Nobody had responded. Not in 994 years. The buoy had just kept transmitting because that was what it was built to do. It had a power cell rated for 1,200 years. It still had 4% charge remaining. It had been floating here in the dark, between the debris and the nothing, saying the same 43 seconds over and over, to a galaxy that had stopped listening before it ever started. This is Earth. We are ready to join you. Dove sat down in the co-pilot seat. He did not say anything. He was running the same calculations I was running, arriving at the same place I had already arrived, and it was not a good place. We should bring it aboard, he said, already extending the recovery arm. The buoy came in through the cargo bay door with a sound like an old bone settling. It was cylindrical, about 2 m long, coated in the kind of heat-resistant shell that was standard for diplomatic beacons 1,000 years ago. There were micro-impact scars across one side, small ones, the casual accumulation of a millennium drifting through space. The Assembly crest was still visible on its face, slightly faded. Beside it, the Earth designation code. Peary was waiting in the cargo bay when I got there. she was 19, the youngest of us by a significant margin, born on a colony station that did not appear in any official registry. She had grown up knowing she technically did not exist as far as the assembly was concerned. It gave her a particular quality of calm around bureaucratic absurdity. She looked at the buoy for a long time. "Is that real?" she asked. "It is. And it's been out here the whole time. Just broadcasting. 4% power cell remaining," I said. "It would have kept going for another 160 years." Peary crouched down in front of the buoy and studied the Earth crest on its face. She had never seen that symbol outside of a history file, neither had Dove. I had seen it once on an old photograph. In my family's records, a photograph of a building in a city that no longer existed on a planet that had been reclassified as a dead world 847 years ago. The photograph was in my bunk. I had carried it for 11 years across 16 different ships, and I had never once explained it to anyone. I did not explain it now either. "We're returning it," I said. Peary looked up. "To where?" "To whoever decided nobody was coming back for it." I was already walking back to the cockpit when Dove caught up with me. He had that reasonable question expression going at full intensity. "Mara," he said, "returning it means going to the assembly." "Good math. We are an unregistered salvage crew on an unregistered vessel with an expired operating license and roughly 40 credits of fuel margin. Also good math. The assembly is a 40-day transit from here. 36 if I push the engines. The engines need the 30 days to rest." I sat down in the pilot's seat and began plotting the course. "Then it's a good thing you know how to work under pressure." Dove stood in the doorway for a moment. He was quiet, which was unusual for him. Then he said, not in his reasonable question voice, but in a different voice, entirely a quieter one, "Do you think anyone is going to care?" I pulled up the assembly frequency. I let the buoy signal play through the cockpit speakers one more time. And GT, snorts. And GT, 43 seconds, the same words that had been playing to nobody for 994 years. "This is Earth. We are ready to join you. We look forward to meeting you." I killed the playback. "I care," I said. "That's enough to start." The Verity turned out of the debris field and pointed her nose toward the core systems. Behind us, the spot where the buoy had floated for a millennium was empty. Ahead of us, 36 days of engine stress and protein bricks, and a plan that had no plan in it yet. Dove went back to the engine bay without another word. I heard him start working. The familiar sound of him solving a problem he had not agreed to, but had decided to commit to anyway. Peary stayed in the cargo bay with the buoy for a long time. I know because I checked the internal camera once. She was sitting on the floor beside it, not touching it, just sitting with it. She snorts, had her knees pulled up to her chest, and she was looking at the Earth crest like it was trying to say something she had not quite learned to hear yet. I turned the camera off. I set the navigation, locked in the course, and started running fuel calculations for a ship that had no business making this trip. The power cell on the buoy read 4%. I wrote that in the ship's log. I noted the condition of the outer shell, the micro-impact, and registration date. I recorded all of it with the same care I would give to any valuable salvage item. I did not write anything else. The Verity pushed forward into the dark. And behind us, the silence of the Cassini expanse closed back over the place where the beacon had been, patient and total and completely unbothered by the fact that something had finally answered. The Assembly's public record called it civilizational cessation, Class 4. Uncontested. That was the official phrase. I found it on the second day of transit, buried a database index under a section header that translated roughly as historical species designations resolved. Earth had a file number. Humanity had a file number 847 years old, stamped in, cross-referenced and nested inside 3 layers of archival bureaucracy that nobody had touched since the original clerks who filed it had themselves been dead for centuries. I read the whole file. It took 4 hours because Assembly legal documents are written in a language that seems designed to make the reader give up, but I have a particular problem with giving up, so I read every page. The finding of extinction had been made by the Assembly Civilizational Status Committee, 9 members, quorum of 6. Required for a declaration. They had achieved quorum. The vote was 7-2. The 2 dissenting members had filed a minority opinion citing insufficient verification of actual population collapse, and that minority opinion had been noted, logged, and then sealed inside the same archival folder where it had been sitting ever since. Unread. Verification, that was the word that kept appearing. Assembly law required verification before a Class 4 declaration could be made final. Verification meant physical confirmation, a vessel sent to the coordinates on record, sensor sweeps, contact attempts on all registered frequencies. The law was clear. You did not declare a species extinct without checking. No verification vessel had ever been dispatched. The record noted the reason in a single sentence tucked inside a procedural footnote. Verification waived due to corroborating evidence of civilizational collapse from 3 independent observational sources. 3 independent observational sources. I dug into that. It took another 2 hours. The 3 sources turned out to be a Vathani survey drone that had passed through the outer Sol system and detected elevated radiation signatures consistent with catastrophic industrial failure, a second-hand merchant report describing no active communications traffic on Earth standard broadcast frequencies, and an academic paper published by a Keth historian arguing that humanity's geopolitical instability in the century prior made collapse statistically probable. A drone, a merchant rumor, an academic paper. That was the evidence base for filing. Humanity under-resolved. Nobody had gone to check. Nobody had sent a ship to the surface. Nobody had tried hailing on the diplomatic frequencies, the ones that would have reached the colony ships, the ones that would have reached the fringe stations, the ones that would have reached us. They had looked at the data from a comfortable distance, decided the math was close enough, and filed the paperwork. I closed the archive window and sat for a while looking at the navigation display. Dav came in with 2 cups of something that was technically coffee if you were not too strict about definitions. He set one in front of me and sat down. You found something, he said. It was not a question. They never verified. I pulled up the relevant section, and turned the display toward him. Assembly law requires a physical verification mission before any Class 4 declaration. They skipped it. Dav read the section, his jaw tightened slightly. That's not a small procedural gap. No, it is not. That means the declaration is technically defective. Under assembly law, yes, a declaration made without required verification can be challenged and voided. It's in their own rulebook. I turned the display back toward me, Chapter 41, Section 9. Dav was quiet for a moment, then, "You're not just returning the buoy." "I am returning the buoy." "You're going to challenge the declaration." "I am returning the buoy," I said again. "And then I will mention some procedural concerns." He looked at me for a long time. "You have a plan." "I have a direction. Plans require resources. We have a salvage tug and a beacon that has been talking to nobody for 1,000 years. Myra." "The paperwork is wrong," I said. "I'm going to go point that out, that's all." Piri appeared in the doorway. She had been in the cargo bay most of the day, and she had that particular expression she got when she had been thinking hard about something and had arrived somewhere she was not sure she wanted to be. "There are others," she said. I looked at her. "Say that again." "I've been on the Assembly's open network for 6 hours. She came in and leaned against the wall. "There are human settlements out there. Unregistered ones, colony ships that kept going when everything fell apart. Stations built in the gaps between recognized space. Small populations. Hidden infrastructure, no assembly. Flag." She paused. "I found 17 signal traces that match human broadcasting coding. That's just what I found. There are probably more." The number sat in the room for a moment. 17, Dav said. "At minimum." I had known intellectually that the colony ships had scattered. I had grown up on the belt, and the belt had been settled for 2 centuries before the collapse, and the people who had left on generation ships before everything stopped being livable had simply kept going. But 17 identifiable traces. Settlements, people who had been living in the dark between recognized space for centuries. No map, no flag, official existence. Not extinct, just not counted. Dav said slowly, "We should contact them first. Build some kind of coalition before we walk into the assembly." I dead floated that idea without hesitation. A coalition takes 20 years. And a shared logo. We have a diplomatic buoy, a procedural loophole, and 32 days of fuel. "But we're 3 people," he said, "on a salvage tug. The Varades is a credentialed diplomatic vessel," I said. "Technically, the registration is 1,000 years old, but it was never revoked. Extinct species do not get their diplomatic credentials formally canceled. There is no procedure for that. Nobody wrote the procedure because nobody thought they would need it." Piri looked at me carefully. "So we can dock." Chapter 11, Section 3 of Assembly. Docking Protocol. Any vessel bearing valid diplomatic credentials of a recognized member species is entitled to berth access at designated assembly stations. I pulled up the credential file I had spent most of the previous night reconstructing from the Earth Diplomatic Registry Archive. Earth's credentials were filed 994 years ago, never expired, never revoked. Dav sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. He looked back at me. Extinct doesn't mean expelled, I said. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Dav stood up, set down his coffee, and walked back toward the engine bay. I'm going to need to run a full diagnostic on the docking interface, he said, and reinforce the heat shielding on the forward bay and probably find us something better to wear. The engine first, I said. The engine first, he agreed. Peary sat down in the co-pilot seat. She pulled up the 17 signal traces on her secondary display and began mapping them. I watched her for a moment, this 19-year-old who had been born into invisible space, charting a map of people who were not supposed to exist. Do you think they know? She asked. The other settlements, do you think they know about the assembly declaration? Some of them must. And they just stayed quiet. I thought about that, about what it meant to keep your head down for centuries, about the math of survival, when the universe has decided you are no longer relevant, when you've been told you don't exist long enough, I said, you start to believe it. Peary looked at her map. We don't believe it. No, I said, we don't. The Varatis pushed forward, 32 days to Spoke Station, 3 people and a buoy, and a procedural argument that was either going to change something or end our operating license permanently. I ran the fuel calculations again. The numbers were tight. They were always tight. That had never stopped us before. Spoke Station looked like someone had built a city and then kept building upward until the city forgot it was supposed to stop. I saw it first on the long-range sensors, a signature so large the display initially tried to classify it as a small moon. By the time we got close enough to see it with real optics, the 3 of us were standing in the cockpit in silence, looking at something that none of us had the right vocabulary to describe. It was the political center of the known galaxy. 43 species maintained permanent diplomatic missions there. The traffic around it was constant and layered. Vessels of every configuration moving in coordinated streams according to protocols so old and established they had become a kind of architecture in their own right. The Varatis was approximately the size of a large transit bus. We had been in transit for 36 days. The engines had complained for 35 of them. David kept them running through combination of technical skill and what I suspected was a negotiation process he conducted privately with machinery he had formed personal relationships with. Peary had spent the transit mapping human signal traces and building a picture of scattered settlements that was larger and more detailed than anything in the Assembly's records. I had spent it reading Assembly law until I understood it better than I wanted to. We were ready, or we were as close to ready as 3 people in a salvage tug with expired licenses and a 1,000-year-old diplomatic credential were ever going to get. I opened the diplomatic hailing frequency, Earth's assigned channel, the one that had been sitting reserved and inactive in the Assembly's communication infrastructure for nearly a millennium, never reassigned because reassignment. Dead species channel was not a procedure anyone had written down. I transmitted on it. The response time was 11 seconds. Then a Port Authority voice came back. Automated and crisp, unidentified. Vessel, please transmit full registration and species designation for processing. I transmitted the Earth registration file, all of it, the original filing. From 994 years ago, the diplomatic credentials, the birth assignment for Doc 7 that had been pre-allocated when the buoy was first launched pending Earth's formal arrival never cancelled. The response time was significantly longer this time, 48 seconds, than another voice, this one human in the way that meant it was trying to sound calm and not entirely succeeding. Vessel transmitting Earth registration codes, the voice said carefully. Please confirm, are you claiming diplomatic credentials under the original Earth filing of year 440, 1 assembly standard? Confirmed, I said. Another pause. That registration is listed as dormant pending the filing. Party's arrival. We have arrived, I said. The pause this time was long enough that I checked the communication array to make sure the channel was still open. Stand by, the voice said. We stood by. Dove behind me very quietly. This is either going to work or we are going to get arrested. Both of those move the situation forward, I said. How does getting arrested move the situation forward? At minimum, we would be on record. Peary made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The channel opened again, a new voice. This time older, with the particular texture of someone who had spent decades managing situations they were not adequately prepared for and had developed a professional smoothness about it. This is Senior Port Administrator Velen of the Vithani Coordination Office, the voice said. I'm reviewing your registration claim. The berth you are requesting, Doc 7, is currently unoccupied and has been unoccupied for the full period of record. That is consistent with our understanding, I said. The claim is being processed. Please maintain current position. 17 minutes passed. I watched the traffic streams around the station continuing in their orderly patterns. I watched vessels the size of city districts moving in and out of the larger docking sectors. I watched the varieties sitting in the waiting corridor looking like something someone had lost and forgotten to report. Then vessel varieties, you are cleared for Doc 7, proceed on the assigned approach vector. I looked at Dove. He looked at me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. That actually worked, Peary said from the back. Run the math on that one, I said. Inertia is free. Doc 7 was in a smaller sector of the station, the kind that had been built in an earlier era and not significantly expanded since. It fit, though, varieties with room to spare, which was the first time a dock had ever done that. The umbilical connected with a clean seal, the air recyclers normalized, the status board showed green across all indicators. We were docked at the Galactic Assembly's primary station, legally, using credentials that were 994 years old because nobody had ever written the procedure to cancel them. The entry corridor was empty when we stepped through. It did not stay empty. By the time we reached the main transit hub, there were people gathering, not a crowd, more like a spreading reaction. The way information moves through complex system, first one person stopping to look, then two people stopping to look at the one who stopped, and then a cluster, and then something larger than a cluster fanning out through the hub in concentric rings. Every species in that hub knew what humans looked like. They had seen us in history files and academic records, the documentary archives that were standard in assembly education. We were famous the way dead things become famous. The expressions on the faces around us were not hostile, they were something harder to manage than hostile. They were the expressions of people encountering something their understanding of the world had told them was impossible. I kept walking. Dove stayed at my left shoulder, Peary stayed at my right. We were halfway across the hub when an elderly figure stepped into our path. He was Keth. I recognized the species from reference files, long-limbed with a particular stillness that characterized older members of their culture. He wore diplomatic dress that indicated senior. Standing, he was moving slowly, leaning on a walking support, and when he stepped into our path, he stopped and simply looked at me. His eyes were very old and very clear. He said something in Keth, a phrase spoken low, almost to himself. His aide, standing a half step behind him, reached for a translation device and then seemed to change her mind and translated directly. It is an archaic expression, the aide said carefully. The meaning is approximate. It refers to light arriving from a star that was believed to have died. It is an old blessing. I looked at the elderly Keth diplomat. He had not looked away from me. There was something in his face that I did not have a clean word for, something that sat in the space between grief and relief and had been sitting there so long it had settled into something quieter than either. We have been traveling, I said. He inclined his head very slightly. I inclined mine back. Then I kept walking because if I stopped walking, I was not confident I would be able to start again, and there was still a great deal left to do. Behind us, the hub remained exactly as crowded and exactly as silent as it had been when we crossed it. Ahead of us, the assemblies, administrative corridors waited, full of people who were about to have a problem they did not have a procedure for. I was looking forward to introducing them to it. The chamber was built to make you feel small. I had read about it. I had seen images in the archive files, but images do not carry the specific weight of a space that has been accumulating institutional authority for 3,000 years. The ceiling was high enough that the upper galleries were lit differently than the floor, as if the architects had understood that light itself would behave with more gravity in a place like this. There were hundreds of seats arranged in a descending curve, each one assigned to a species with a recognized presence in the assembly. Translation matrices hummed at frequencies I could feel at the back of my teeth. The public galleries above were standing capacity. And then some word had moved fast through the station, and the assembly had been forced to open the overflow monitors in 4 separate viewing areas. I walked down the central aisle with Dove on my left and Peary on my right, and I was aware of every single one of those hundreds of seats in the way you are aware of something when it is watching you and you are choosing not to look back. I was wearing my salvage suit. I had cleaned it. The patch over the old company logo was visible, and I had decided not to care about that. Dove was in a jacket that fit him moderately well. He had sourced it from the station's public exchange during our 8 hours of waiting for the emergency session to be formally convened, and it was slightly too long in the sleeves, and he wore it with complete dignity. Peary had refused any change of clothes. She stood in her colony station workwear, like it was a statement, because it was. I carried the buoy in both arms. It was heavier than its size suggested, all that dense casing, all that power cell. I set it on the podium at the base of the chamber with a sound that echoed upward through all that institutional space. The speaker of the session was Drow. I had researched her 300 years in her position, which was not unusually long. For her species, she had a reputation for precision that the assembly files documented in dry language, and that people who had argued before her described in much more feeling terms. She looked at me for a moment before opening the session. Then she opened it. The Vithani block was the loudest in the first 15 minutes. Their primary representative, a diplomat named Council Oreth, was skilled and composed and had clearly spent the transit time from wherever he had been when this started, preparing arguments which I respected. He argued standing authority, historical continuity, the disruption that any review would cause to the territorial arrangements that had been built over the past 8 centuries in good faith by species who had acted on the information available to them. He was not wrong about any of that. The information had been available, species had acted in good faith, arrangements had been built. They had just been built on a declaration that was procedurally defective, and that was not something that good faith could retroactively correct. I let him finish. I had learned a long time ago that letting people finish is a form of argument in itself. Then I reached over and activated the buoy. The 43-second loop filled the chamber, clean and clear through the translation matrices in the original audio, the voice of a communications engineer who had recorded it 994 years ago in a studio in a city that no longer existed. This is Earth. We are ready to join you. We look forward to meeting you. I let it play for the full 43 seconds. Then I let it loop once more. Chamber was silent in a way that large spaces are not usually silent, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of attention. I killed the playback. That signal has been broadcasting for 994 years, I said. It was still transmitting when we found it. It has 4% power cell remaining. It would have kept broadcasting for another 160 years without anyone hearing it. I paused. We are ready to join you, I said. That is what it says, not was says. Present tense, because the signal is still active. I let that sit. Then I pulled up the legal document I had been for 36 days. The Assembly's Declaration of Civilizational Cessation for the Species. Designation Earth, filed 847 years ago, is procedurally defective. I kept my voice level, not angry, precise. Chapter 41, Section 9 of the Assembly's own foundational charter requires physical verification before any class 4 declaration may be finalized. Vessel must be dispatched to the recorded coordinates of the subject species. Contact must be attempted on all registered frequencies. Sensor confirmation must be obtained and entered into the primary record. I looked up from the document. None of that was done. The verification requirement was waived based on a survey drone reading, a second-hand merchant report, and an academic paper. These sources are documented in the original filing. None of them constitute physical verification. As defined by Assembly law, the declaration was filed without the legally required evidence base. Council Oreth was on his feet before I finished the sentence. The speaker raised one hand without looking at him, and he sat back down. The precision she was famous for was apparently thorough. Continue, the speaker said. A procedurally defective declaration is under assembly law subject to formal review and potential voiding. That is not a political argument. That is not a request. That is the mechanism the assembly built into its own charter to protect against exactly this kind of error. I looked around the chamber. I am not here to argue about territorial arrangements or political consequences. I am here to note that the paperwork is wrong. The assembly's own rules say what happens when the paperwork is wrong. The chamber was very loud for several minutes after that. I stood at the podium and waited. Dove stood behind me and did not move. Peary stood behind Dove and did not move. Noise was species-specific and layered, and ran through the translation matrices at a pace that turned it into a kind of weather system, high-pressure zones of objection meeting low-pressure zones of stunned silence. The speaker called order twice. The third time she did not raise her voice, but something in her stillness produced quiet faster than volume had. Counsel Orath, when he was permitted to speak, was careful. He had moved past the standing authority argument. He was now on the practical consequences argument, which was the stronger one, even if the declaration was defective on procedural grounds. The implications for territorial arrangements that had been in place for 800 years were extraordinary. Species had built infrastructure. Populations had relocated. The asteroid belt of the Sol system alone had been transformed over 3 centuries into agricultural production that now fed 7 species colony networks. He was right. The consequences were extraordinary. I did not argue that they were not. We are not here to demand the dismantling of 800 years of arrangements in a single session. I said, we are here to note that those arrangements were built on a declaration that should not have been made final without verification. What follows from that finding is a process, not an outcome. The assembly has procedures for contested territorial claims. We are asking those procedures to be applied. The speaker spoke for the first time in something other than procedural management. She looked at me directly. There is a practical question that the chamber will want answered, she said. You represent 3 individuals on a salvage vessel. What is the actual extent of the human population you are claiming to represent? It was the right question. I had been waiting for it. Assembly's own record lists humanity's population as 0, I said. Our actual population, based on the settlement traces we have identified during transit, is not 0. The exact count requires a survey we have not had the resources to conduct, but the legal threshold for species recognition in Assembly Charter is not a population number. It is a credentialed representative appearing on behalf of a living population. I looked at her steadily. I am here. We are alive. The threshold is met. Silence. Then the speaker said, the chamber will recess for deliberation. It was not a victory. I want to be precise about that. It was a door opening. What was behind the door was years of legal process, political pressure, deliberations that would grind through assembly committees at the speed that institutions grind, territorial reviews that every affected species would contest with everything available to them. But it was a door, and it had not been there this morning. We waited in a side chamber while the Assembly deliberated, the three of us. The buoy on the floor between our chairs. Peary sat with her hands in her lap and did not talk. Dove made a sound. At one point that might have been a laugh and might have been something else, and did not explain it. I looked at the buoy. 4%. Still transmitting. When the speaker's aide came to bring us back into the chamber, she paused in the doorway and looked at the buoy. She was young, draw like the speaker, and she had the particular expression of someone trying to hold a very large feeling in a professional container. Is it still transmitting? She asked. Yes, I said. She nodded once and let us back in. The speaker announced the finding in precise and unadorned language, the declaration of civilizational cessation. For Earth was to be formally annotated. Pending review. Humanity's status in the Assembly record was to be updated immediately. The updated status effective from the session was status contested. Not recognized, not restored, contested. I sat with that word. Contested meant there was an argument. Contested meant the record acknowledged that both sides of the argument existed. Contested meant that 847 years of filed paperwork no longer had the last word. It was not everything, but it was in the record now, and records do not unexist. The station's public network updated at 300 station time. I was awake when it happened. I had been awake since we walked out of the chamber, too alert to sleep, too tired to do anything useful with the alertness. I was sitting in the Varieties' cockpit with a navigation display dark and a cup of real coffee that the Cath diplomatic mission had sent over with a note that contained only an archaic blessing and no other text. The public network update came through as a standard administrative notification, species status record, amended Earth designation class 4, civilizational cessation finding, annotated, status updated to contested, pending formal review process. 4 lines of text. 947 years of wrong information replaced by 4 lines of text. I read it twice. Then I closed the notification and looked out the forward viewport at the traffic lanes around the station, all those vessels moving in their established patterns, the galaxy continuing to function in the way it had been functioning for centuries, largely untroubled by the fact that something had just shifted in its records. Dov appeared from the back at 4:30. He had slept, which I had told him to do, and was glad he had done. He sat in the co-pilot seat and read the network update on his personal display, and did not say anything for a long time. Peary was up by 600. She read the update, nodded once, and went directly to her communication terminal. She had been building the contact list for 36 days. 17 signal traces mapped, frequencies identified, encoding protocols reverse engineered from broadcast patterns old enough that the original reference documents were in archive files rather than active databases. She had not sent anything yet. We had agreed to wait until the assembly session was resolved before making any contact with the scattered settlements, because the news needed to be real before we sent it. It was real now. She looked at me, I nodded. She drafted the message in about 4 minutes. She showed it to me before she sent it. It was short, 2 sentences and a position beacon. The position beacon was ours. I read it and said, send it. She sent it on every human coded Frequency we had identified. 17 known traces plus the general band. The one that any human-built receiver would pick up if it was still functional and pointed in the right direction. Then we waited. The Vithani block had filed 3 formal objections to the review process by 800. I had been expecting that. Their legal team was efficient and their interest in the Sol system were substantial, and they were going to fight this for as long as the Assembly's procedural calendar allowed them to fight it, which was potentially decades. That was real, and I did not minimize it. Councillor Eth sent a formal message to the Varati's diplomatic address at 900. It was professionally courteous, which I respected. It noted that the Vithani collective did not dispute the procedural finding, but intended to argue strenuously that any review process must account for the transformative infrastructure investment made in the Sol system over the past 3 centuries and the populations that now depended on it. I sent back a reply that was equally courteous and noted that we agreed those considerations were material and expected them to be part of the review process. The Keth block sent no formal message. What they sent was a request for a private meeting with the senior human diplomatic representative. I was the senior human diplomatic representative. That title still felt like wearing a jacket 2 sizes too large, but I wore it. The meeting was with the elderly diplomat I had seen in the hub. His name was Elder Council Tev, and he had been in his position for 112 years, which for his species represented a middle career posting. He sat across a low table in a small meeting room in the Keth mission, and he poured 2 cups of something warm, and he looked at me with those very old, very clear eyes. My species was allied with Earth, he said before. I know, I read the historical record. We voted against the cessation declaration. We filed the minority opinion. I found it. It was sealed in the archive. He nodded slowly. We expected someone to come and unseal it. For decades we expected that, then we stopped expecting it, but we did not change our position. He looked at his cup. When a star is believed dead, you do not hold a memorial and go home. You continue to monitor. You continue to record in the event that you were wrong. I thought about the buoy, 4% power cell, broadcasting to nobody for 994 years. That's a very long time to continue monitoring, I said. Yes, he said, but here you are. I met his gaze. Here I am. He slid a document across the table. I picked it up. It was a formal letter of support for the review petition signed by the full Keth diplomatic bloc, dated the morning after our assembly session. It had been ready to go before we even filed. They had been waiting for someone to file. We will support the process, he said. We will support the recognition petition when it comes to a full vote. We cannot guarantee the outcome, but we will not be absent from it. Thank you, I said. Do not thank me. He picked up his cup. Thank whoever built a power cell rate for 1,200 years. I almost smiled. It was the closest I had come to it since we pulled the buoy out of the Cassini expanse. I got back to the Varatis at 1,400. Piri had been on the communication terminal all morning. I looked at her face when I came through the door and knew that something had happened. First response came in at 10:23, she said, and her voice was careful in the way voices get when they are carrying Something fragile. Generation ship, Kepler drift lane. 17,000 people. They have been in transit for 630 years. Their original destination was a star system that assembly records now classify as Vithani. Agricultural territory. 17,000 people on a ship that had been traveling for 6 centuries toward a home that someone had quietly claimed while they were in transit. What did they say? I asked. Peary turned the display toward me. The message was 12 words. We received your signal. We are alive. Tell us what to do. I sat down. Dov from the doorway, how many responses? That one so far, Peary said, but it has only been 4 hours. I looked at the 12 words on the display. 12 words from 17,000 people who had been living in the dark between recognized space for 600 years. No map, no flag, no official existence, just the engine running and the stars moving past in the daily work of survival in a universe that had filed them under resolved. What do we tell them? Peary asked. Outside the viewport, the station traffic moved in its orderly patterns. The Vithani's 3 formal objections were sitting in the assemblies. Processing queue. The review timeline was going to be measured in years. The political resistance was going to be measured in decades. The people in that generation ship were going to need somewhere to be in the meantime, and the legal framework for giving them somewhere to be did not exist yet, and building it was going to require work that would outlast every current diplomatic relationship and probably several careers. I looked at the 12 words. I thought about the buoy, 4% never giving up, not because it was brave, because it was built to keep going, and nobody had told it to stop. Tell them to hold their current course, I said. Tell them their status in the assembly record is contested, which means they are no longer invisible. Tell them to respond with their population count, resource status, and any critical needs. I paused and tell them they are not alone out there. Peary began typing. Dov came in and sat down and did not say anything. He looked at the display. He looked at me. He had that reasonable question expression in full effect, but for once he was not asking the question. By 1800, there were 4 more responses. A colony station in the outer Fornex drift, population 800, had been operating in radio silence for 3 centuries as a matter of survival. Practice had almost not responded to our signal because the habit of silence was that deep. A generation ship carrying the descendants of a university of evacuation program, 1,200 people, had been sustaining a research program the entire time, had a database of 6 centuries of astronomical observation that no recognized institution had ever seen. A cluster of 3 small stations operating as a linked community in a debris field in what the assembly maps labeled as uninhabited space. Combined population 4,200. Had developed their own dialect, had children who had never seen a planet. A single ship, 1 person, a woman named Clara, who had been an extended solo drift for reasons her message did not explain, monitoring frequencies. Waiting, she did not say what she had been waiting for. She did not need to tell me what to do, her message said. Same as the generation ship. 4 words. This time instead of 12, the same meaning. I answered each one personally, not 4 messages, personal ones, short because there was a lot to say and I was not going to be able to say it all today. But personal. By midnight we had 11 responses. By the next morning 19. By the end of the week 43. The Assembly's review process began its formal first stage 14 days after our session. I attended the opening meeting with Elder Counsel Tev beside me and a legal document that had grown from the original 36 days of transit work to something 4 times its original size, incorporating case law from 800 years of Assembly precedent and the population data from the 43 settlements we had now been in contact with. The variety block was well prepared. The review was going to be long. I had read enough Assembly history to know that long did not mean impossible. It meant sustained. It meant showing up to every session, filing every required document, answering every procedural challenge with a procedural response, building the record line by line in the only language that institutional power actually speaks. I was good at reading documents. I was patient in the specific way that comes from spending a decade in salvage work, which teaches you that the thing you are looking for is almost always there if you keep looking. The variety stayed docked at Spoke Station. She was the smallest vessel in any of the docking sectors by a significant margin, and I had stopped finding that embarrassing somewhere around the 3rd week. I took her out twice during the review process. Once to meet the generation ship in the Kepler drift lane because 17,000 people who had been traveling for 600 years deserved to have someone come out to them. The meeting lasted 3 days. I spent most of it in conversation with their council of navigators, people who had been born on that ship and whose parents had been born on that ship and whose grandparents had been born on that ship, people who knew every inch of a vessel that had become a world to them, people who had kept going because going was all they knew. They asked a lot of questions. I answered the ones I could. For the ones I could not, I told them that was what the process was for, and that the process had started and that they were in it now, whether the Assembly liked it or not. Their eldest council member, a woman named Ruth, who was 93 years old and had the eyes of someone who had been looking at stars her whole life, shook my hand. When I left, she held it for a moment. My grandmother's grandmother was born on Earth, she said. I held her hand back, so was mine. We looked at each other for a moment. 2 people connected by a line that ran through 600 years of dark and distance, and administrative paperwork, and a power cell that was down to 4%. Thank you for finding us, she said. Thank you for answering, I said. The second time I took the varieties out was 4 months into the review process, on a day when the Assembly's procedural committee had recessed for a 2-week deliberation period that I could not accelerate regardless of what I did. I had 43 active contact channels in a legal file that required daily maintenance and a schedule that had expanded to fill every available hour. I needed to move. I flew out to the edge of the Cassini expanse, the debris field where we had found the buoy. I parked in the same rough coordinates we had been in when the receiver pinged, and I sat in the cockpit in the dark, and I looked at the empty patch of space where the buoy had been floating for 994 years. The buoy was in my bunk. I had moved it there from the cargo bay weeks ago. I did not examine my reasons for that with any particular rigor. I sat in the cockpit for 2 hours, not thinking in any organized way, just being in the place where it had started, letting the silence of the expanse do what silence does when you stop fighting. Then I turned the varieties around and went back to work. The review process ran for 3 years. I will not recount every session, every procedural challenge, every moment. The weight of it felt like something that was going to outlast me. I will say that the Keth block never wavered and that 6 other species joined them as the contact list grew, and the population data became harder to dismiss, and that by the end of the first year the Assembly had established a provisional status category called Recognized Pending Rev.